Hello and welcome to the Royal Society Centre for History of Science. Our speaker today is Dr. Greg Lynall from the University of Liverpool, and the title of his talk is Laputian Newtons, the Science and Politics of Swift's Gulliver's Travels.
Thank you, Felicity, and thank you everyone for coming along. Today I'll be talking particularly about the Voyage to Laputa, which is the third part of Swift's masterpiece and generally seen as the world's most famous satire on science. My research on Swift has been concerned with reconstructing what he knew about natural philosophy and its practitioners in the early 18th century and exploring how he incorporated that knowledge within his imaginative writings, including the voyages of Lemuel Gulliver. It's often thought that Swift was vehemently opposed to scientific inquiry, and so I've been interested in interrogating that assumption. I've discovered that much of what Swift wrote about the sciences was bound up with other concerns, especially the personal and political, which our reading should take into account, I think. Science does, in some instances, constitute a significant target of Swift's satiric wrath. But where this is the case, it's often accompanied by a sense of revelry in the creative potency, the new ideas that such pursuits provided. Now, Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, now known as Gulliver's Travels, was published anonymously in London in October 1726, and according to Swift's friend John Gay, was universally read, from the highest to the lowest, from the Cabinet Council to the nursery. Now, despite the recent cinematic efforts of Jack Black to consign this story to the cultural dustbin, it continues to delight readers around the world nearly 300 years later. And its attraction is partly because it can be interpreted in general ways that still speak to us now, helping us to consider what it means to be human, how societies are constructed, and what human knowledge is or can be. But Swift himself acknowledged that most of his works were temporary, occasional things that die naturally with the change of times, as he wrote to one friend. And Gulliver's Travels contains numerous episodes that can be interpreted allegorically, normally as representations of contemporary politics or other aspects of culture. And the book is also highly elusive in terms of how it uses other texts, incorporating various genres, not just a travel book, but also the fairy tale, moral fable, utopian fantasy, memoir, novel, and scientific treatise. Now, allusions to the sciences are at their highest in both number and magnitude in the third book, The Voyage to Laputa. But the story as a whole is permeated with the ideas, discoveries, and practices associated with the experimental philosophy and other new forms of knowledge that came to prominence during the early modern period. The travelogue form that Swift parodies had become increasingly influenced by empirical modes of observation during the 17th century, and reports of voyages and field trips were often found within the pages of the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, gratifying a readership that was fascinated by exotic and prodigious specimens of nature. So in the Travels we have the protagonist and first-person narrator Lemuel Gulliver describing far-fetched cultures and events that make the reader question its truthfulness, such as the tiny but petty and politics-obsessed Lilliputians, the gigantic Brobdingnagians, and the ultra-rationalistic horses, the Houyhnhnms. But despite all of those fanciful encounters, stylistically the narrative insists upon its factuality and simplicity. And part of this is achieved through Gulliver's pedantic focus on quantification and measurement. In applying mathematical precision to objects that challenge realism, I'm thinking here particularly of when Gulliver weighs and measures the Brobdingnagian hailstones that are nearly 1,800 times as large as those in Europe. Swift is simultaneously satirising and drawing imaginative power from that impulse for authenticity. But of course, part of the joke is that for all of these far-off places, that they're actually mirror images of Europe and of Britain in Ireland in particular, that Gulliver journeys to places unknown within current cartographies, but that look just like home. Swift began work on the Travels aged around 54, holding the position of Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, and slightly resentful that his days in London were long past. The first and second voyages were written in 1721 and 22, the fourth voyage next, and significantly the third voyage last during 1724 and 25. In Book 3, Gulliver visits the flying island of Laputa, which is propelled through the air by magnetic forces and hovers over the land of Balnabarby. Laputa is home to a royal court of introverted men obsessed with mathematics and astronomy. This race of mortals are singular in their shapes, habits and countenances, and with a corresponding mental uniformity, they all require an attendant flapper to bash a bladder to the mouth or ear to wake them up from their intense speculations. And the identity of this mass is suitably depicted in this copperplate image by Johann Sebastian Müller that was included in the 1754 edition. And Gulliver is to the left of the illustration, and he's got a face sort of suggesting both wonder and bemusement, really, at these curious specimens of nature. And these monotonous clones that we see here perhaps serve to reflect the cultural ubiquity of science among the fashionable classes in the early 18th century, when coffeehouse lectures and periodicals, such as Joseph Addison's Spectator, promoted natural philosophy as a source of refinement. The Laputian court has also been identified specifically with the Hanoverian House and Whig government, which gave patronage to followers of Newton, such as the controversial theologian Samuel Clarke, who would be targeted by Swift in his 1729 poem Directions for a Birthday Song. Now, with their heads literally stuck up in the clouds, the Laputians are continually worried about the prospect of solar or cometary apocalypse, and have calculated that in 31 years' time a comet will probably destroy us. If, in its perihelion, it should approach within a certain degree of the sun, as by their calculations they have reason to dread, it will conceive a degree of heat 10,000 times more intense than that of red-hot glowing iron, and in its absence from the sun carry a blazing tail 10,014 miles long, through which, if the Earth should pass at a distance of 100,000 miles from the nucleus or main body of the comet, it must, in its passage, be set on fire and reduced to ashes. Now, despite the numerical specificity and elaborate Newtonian nomenclature that's contained within the Laputians' predictions, the conjectural nature of their theories is made plain. Even if the knowledge of such catastrophes could be acted upon, there are far too many conditionals in their predictions to take these anxieties seriously. And I think that the passage emphasises a kind of fetishization of mathematically precise predictions of apocalyptic scenarios, of the sort that the 21st century media take such delight in, as we recently saw accompanying the coverage of the close orbit of the Apophis asteroid a few weeks ago. Now, Gulliver later visits an academy in the Balnabarbian city of Legado, where he witnesses a catalogue of flawed scientific pursuits. Extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers is probably the most famous, turning excrement back into its original food, and building houses from the roof down are other notable examples. Gulliver tells us that men with a very little smattering in mathematics but full of volatile spirits had by royal patent established this academy of projectors, immediately bringing to mind the Royal Society, which was granted its first royal charter in 1662. Indeed, Marjorie Nicholson and Nora Molson's groundbreaking essays of the 1930s demonstrated how closely Swift had based the Legarden experiments upon accounts published in the Society's transactions. And so, as a Swift scholar, I'm especially delighted to be speaking here at the Academy of Legado itself today. But while the building looks sound, I've stayed away from the catering just in case. Now, Swift knew very well several natural philosophers and mathematicians whose pursuits and personalities may have informed the creation of his Laputian caricatures. A much abbreviated list includes Dr. John Arbuthnot, the mathematician, physician ordinary to Queen Anne, antiquarian and fellow satirist, whom Swift once called the King of Inattention. Also, the Dublin schoolmaster, Thomas Sheridan, who was altogether ignorant in worldly management and a man of intense and abstracted thinking, enslaved by mathematics, as he says in one letter. And I think there's an interesting sort of discourse of subjection at work here, the sense that math does not describe but bends the universe and people to its will. We also have the merchant Joe Beaumont, whose mental health problems and eventual suicide was sometimes attributed to his growing fixation with maths, and particularly the longitude problem. But more than any other man, over several decades of celebrity, Sir Isaac Newton had established himself as the preeminent intellectual of his generation, and rumours about his eccentricity proliferated. Many could not believe that a man of such genius, who had discovered amongst many other things universal gravitation, the laws of motion, the laws of calculus, the nature of white light, and so on, that such a man who had done all those things could be normal. Swift might have heard, for instance, that when his friend Arbuthnot visited Paris, the mathematician Marquis de l'Hôpital asked him every particular about Sir Isaac, even to the colour of his hair, said, "Does he eat and drink and sleep? Is he like other men?" Now, there seems to have been some truth in such speculation, and Swift probably encountered stories of Newton's aloofness and introspection from an important friend, Catherine Barton, the daughter of Newton's half-sister, Hannah Smith. Now, this is the best digital reproduction of a portrait I could find, Now, Barton, born around 1680, lived with Newton from the early 1700s until his death in March 1727. And in 1717, Barton married John Conduit, who with Barton's assistance attempted to write a biography of step-uncle Isaac. Now, we know that Swift dined with Barton on many occasions during his time in London, perhaps as early as 1707 and maybe up until 1714, and they might have had a correspondence after that. But during this period, Swift told his friend Esther Johnson, the famous Stella, "I love her, Barton, better than anybody here in the capital." And Swift found Catherine a great source of gossip, writing, "Mrs. Barton is still in my good graces. The best intelligence I get of public affairs is from the ladies, for the ministers never tell me anything." And it's likely that Barton also told Swift much about the uncle whose domestic affairs she attended to, and in Laputa such stories were later appropriated and deployed by Swift in satiric form. For instance, in her manuscript notes, Barton described that Newton would sometimes let his dinner stand for hours and eat his supper cold for breakfast because he was so engrossed in his studies, and would have benefited from a flapper or two by his side whilst burning the midnight oil. Now, although the perceived solecisms of many natural philosophers were worthy of satiric censure, or at least comedy in the Voyage to Laputa, there were more significant reasons why Newton might have been singled out for particular criticism by Swift. And these help to explain why Swift sought to include such a venomous satire on science within the travels of Gulliver. And so the next part of my talk, I want to suggest that Swift's motivations were sometimes more political than philosophical, and that the airing of a personal grievance was allied to a more general assault upon the culture of scientific knowledge. In the early 18th century, the Kingdom of Ireland had a poor currency system and gravely lacked small change, with many copper pieces being either below their intrinsic value or counterfeits. And the country had no national mint. And because of that, it was usual for private minters to be called upon to provide the smaller coinage. In July 1722, when Swift was hard at work writing Gulliver's Travels, the English manufacturer William Wood was granted a patent by the British Crown to coin for Ireland 360 tons of copper money over the next 14 years. And here's an example of Wood's halfpence, on one side depicting Hibernia next to a harp. Now, Wood had obtained this sizable contract through bribing George I's mistress, the Duchess of Kendal, and the corruption involved was widely rumoured. Irish commentators feared that the economic situation would be made worse rather than better. The market would be flooded with coinage even more debased and easily forgeable. Alerted to this situation by several Dublin dignitaries, Swift was worried about the coin's intrinsic value, as it was made out of slightly less copper than was customary. But his main concerns were the political circumstances under which the patent was granted to a non-native minter and forced upon the Irish without their consent, as neither the Irish Parliament nor the Commissioners of the Revenue in Dublin had been consulted. Motivated by what he calls perfect hatred of tyranny and oppression, Swift interrupted the composition of the Voyage to Laputa after only a few weeks in order to write the Drapier's Letters, which attempted to encourage a boycott of the new currency and foment a more general atmosphere of protest within the Irish popular imagination. Amidst various attacks upon Wood's halfpence in Ireland, the Royal Treasury in London requested an examination of this privately manufactured coinage. Overseeing this process was the master of the mint, none other than Sir Isaac Newton. The great mathematician first became involved with the mint in 1695 when he was one of 8 men consulted on a crisis in English coinage. Soon after this, Newton's friend Charles Montague, the future Earl of Halifax, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, offered him the wardenship of the mint, and Newton left Cambridge after 35 years there. Then in 1699, when the serving master died, Newton was appointed to this far more profitable role, where he received a payment for each pound of new coinage in addition to a generous salary. So Newton therefore held one of the most lucrative governmental positions at this time, and on top of this was elected President of the Royal Society in 1703 and knighted by Queen Anne in 1705. But after the Tories came back into power in 1710, they tried to force Newton out and even asked Swift to pass on a message to Catherine Barton that the government considered it to be a sin. Newton's thoughts should be diverted by his place at the mint, and that the Queen would settle upon him a pension, which Newton refused. He was not going to be pushed out of a post he had made his own in many ways. Now, I should perhaps clarify at this point that I won't be paying attention to party political differences. Newton was a supporter of and backed by the Whigs. Swift's allegiances shifted over time and are harder to pin down, and he generally saw the prejudice of parties as damaging to political process. It's been argued he adhered to what can be called old Whig principles, in that he supported the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but worked for the Tories as a propagandist, and his high church Anglicanism was also more of a Tory inclination. But in whatever way we might seek to classify him, it's clear that Swift held Robert Walpole's Whig administration responsible for cramming Wood's brass down our throats, to use some of the Drapier's imagery. Now, Newton's assay of Wood's halfpence was held at the Tower of London in April 1724, using specimens which have from time to time been taken from the several parcels coined and sealed up. Newton found the coins were all of full weight, but varied widely, contained copper of about the same goodness and value as that used in English coins, and a vast improvement on recent Irish coinage. Swift's second letter, written using the Drapier pseudonym, passionately questioned Newton's public endorsement of the coinage. Sir Isaac Newton reported an assay at the Tower of Wood's metal, by which it appears that Wood had in all respects performed his contract. His contract with whom? Was it with the Parliament or people of Ireland? They detest, abhor and reject it as corrupt, fraudulent, mingled with dirt and trash. Now, this letter was not only a broad constitutional protest, but also sought to debunk the methods of Newton's impudent and insupportable assay. Wood had been permitted to select the individual batches of coins for testing, and Newton himself had insisted that the sample be brought to London rather than sending men to Wood's foundry in Bristol. Swift's Drapier was therefore suspicious of the sampling procedure. Wood takes care to coin a dozen or two halfpence of good metal, sends them to the Tower, and they are approved, and these must answer for all that he hath already coined or shall coin for the future. I've heard of a man who had a mind to sell his house, and therefore carried a brick in his pocket, which he showed as a pattern to encourage purchasers. And this is directly the case in point with Mr. Wood's assay. So for Swift, the fundamental flaws in the test procedures seem to imply that Newton was either complicit in Wood's act of deception, or had made errors unworthy of his genius. This was perhaps even more astonishing given that the Royal Treasury was using Newton's reputation to assert their authority in the whole affair, stating that the Master of the Mint had been consulted in all the steps of settling and adjusting the terms and conditions of the patent before the King's warrant had been signed. Now, Swift's third Drapier's letter got even more dirty in its tactics, recounting an unverified story that 6 years previously Newton had refereed a competition for the patent between Wood and 3 other men. Wood had made the worst offer, revealing it to be plain with what intentions he solicited this patent, but not so plain how he obtained it. Now, Newton's corruption is, of course, extremely unlikely, but this anecdote was fine fuel for Swift's propaganda campaign and led others to cast aspersions upon Newton's conduct. For instance, an anonymous Dublin poem, A Letter from a Young Lady to the Reverend Dean Swift, didn't mention Newton by name, but aroused suspicion by stating, "The principles by which men move are private interest-based self-love. So far their love or hate extends as serves their own contracted ends." In this intricate conceit here, rather than external forces acting upon a body to change its current state of rest or motion, as explained in Newton's first law, the speaker proffers self-interest as an inherent motivation within the matter of man. While the power of gravity as it extends is dependent upon the proximity of attracting objects, the nature of a man's actions towards others is determined by their own ends. So the poem presents the great writer of the Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, as deficient in principles of morality. Capitulating to the immense political and cultural pressure, the patent for Wood's coinage was eventually surrendered in August 1725, and Swift's Drapier's letters received much of the credit for this. And despite their anonymity, Swift had already been awarded the freedom of the city of Dublin. But Swift did not stop after this success. He clearly harboured resentment for everyone involved in or who had endorsed the scheme. He would continue to find opportunities to question Newton's integrity and find ways to laugh at him for more than his position at the Mint, even after the great man's death. The many facets of Newton's character, professional life and cultural influence each became in Swift's hands vulnerable sites that could be exploited satirically. And this was at a time when Newton's matchless intellect was being celebrated by the majority of authors, including Swift's friend and fellow satirist Alexander Pope, who penned the brilliant epitaph, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light." Now, the most direct example of Swift's fervour is in a complete collection of genteel and ingenious conversation, worked on over many years but not published until 1738. Its narrator, Simon Wagstaff, has a sizable ego that Swift deploys as a vehicle of social satire, giving him license to create provocative caricatures, including one of Newton. "I have been assured by more than one credible person, how some of my enemies have industriously whispered about, that one Isaac Newton, an instrument maker, formerly living near Leicester Fields, and afterwards a workman in the Mint at the Tower, might possibly pretend to vie with me for fame in future times. The man, it seems, was knighted for making sundials better than others of his trade, and was thought to be a conjurer because he knew how to draw lines and circles upon a slate, which nobody could understand. But adieu to all noble attempts for endless renown, if the ghost and obscure mechanic shall be raised up to enter into competition with me, only for his skill in making pot hooks and hangers with a pencil, which many thousand accomplished gentlemen and ladies can perform as well, with a pen and ink, upon a piece of paper, and in a manner as little intelligible as those of Sir Isaac." So reduction is the key satiric tactic here, knocking the celebrity genius down a peg or two. It's a bit like saying Stephen Hawking was given a CBE just for his services to Go Compare adverts. But amongst Swift's cruel jests, he highlights a real problem of communication, which blighted the dissemination of the Newtonian philosophy. According to the notes of Barton and Conduit, even Newton's own students at Cambridge would tease him as he walked down the corridor, saying, "There goes the man who has written a book that neither he nor anyone else understands." And despite the many popular science books and travelling public lecture series over the 18th century that tried to simplify Newton's ideas to the non-specialist. Their comprehension continued to be difficult, and it's demonstrated puntastically in this Cruikshank caricature from the early 19th century, in which an old country gent corrects an optics lecturer by interjecting, "We do not call them hopsticks, but hop poles." Now, in describing Newton as an obscure mechanic, Swift's narrator Wagstaff echoes the Drapier's letter, in which the coin manufacturer Wood is goaded as a poor, private, obscure mechanic. And I think the repetition of this derogatory epithet is unlikely to be a coincidence. Swift not only forges a connection between Newton's studies and the productions of manual workers as a rhetorical strategy, but also brings to mind the Wood's halfpence controversy, through which, in Swift's satiric vision at least, the master of the mint has become socially and morally, perhaps morally tainted. So in the early 18th century, we find a new market associated with natural philosophy arising within the world of prospectors, financiers, engineers, and it's thought there were many unscrupulous and opportunistic projectors exploiting the growing belief in new technology, new knowledge. And Newton's involvement with Swift's halfpence might have confirmed for Swift a suspicion that the authority of science could be used to support projects for individual commercial gain and the exercise of commercial power at the expense of the welfare of the people. So Newton is brazenly lampooned in the collection of genteel conversation, but in Gulliver's Travels, published whilst Newton was still alive, he is more subtly caricatured. Composing much of the Voyage to Laputa in the aftermath of the halfpence affair, this broad assault on the cultural obsession with the new sciences, especially the Newtonian philosophy, was for Swift also an opportunity to carry out attacks upon a man with whom he was deeply disappointed for approving Wood's patent. Now, I don't have time today to go through all the various episodes of latent charge at Newton within Laputa's complex web of allegory, but they include the tailor who takes Gulliver's measurements by quadrant, rule and compasses, but who produces clothes very ill-made and quite out of shape by happening to mistake a figure in the calculation. This possibly alludes to an error in the first edition of the Principia. Also, the Laputians' custom to steal inventions from each other, probably referring to the priority dispute between Newton and Leibniz about the invention of calculus. And also the inclination amongst mathematicians to perpetually inquire into public affairs, giving their judgment in matters of state, which is an obvious Newton resonance, but might also include political arithmeticians whose impulse to value human beings in merely financial terms is parodied by Swift in A Modest Proposal. Now, suffice to say that even if some of the references were not intended as pokes at Newton specifically, the cumulative effect of them suggests that a significant portion of the satire is operating on an intensely personal level, directed at Europe's most famous man of science and master of the mint. Now, although Swift's caricatures of Newton frequently rely upon occupational and social diminution for their satiric effect, reducing him to workman in the mint and tailor and so on, there seems to be almost a paradox in this line of attack. For what is often missing from Laputian society is the practical application of their knowledge. Yet they fail to address current problems or make provision for future needs. They fail to do some real work. And while the Academy of Legardo incubates an array of experiments which are at best impractical, at worst medically, or possibly environmentally irresponsible, outside its walls, the citizens of Balnibarbi are generally poverty-stricken, financially exploited, and politically subordinated. I think Swift is not only making a distinction between pure and applied disciplines, or between abstraction and common sense, although he was certainly sceptical that natural philosophers would fulfill their grand utilitarian claims. Instead, I think the Voyage to Laputa is implying that when the new sciences are employed in practical projects, political, social and moral choices are inevitably involved. Now, these are issues thrown into stark relief when Gulliver divulges that there is a more sinister side to Laputa, in that it keeps control over its colonies on Balnibarbi through force. This gravity-defying island is moved by manipulating a magnetic lodestone at its centre and can be made to hover above any place on Balnabarby the king chooses in order to deprive rebellious subjects of the sun and rain. And this is often interpreted as a reference to England's aggressive laws of trade against Ireland at this time. More drastically, the Laputians threaten to crush buildings in Balnabarby by landing directly on top of them. And so there's something powerfully prescient about how Swift imagines scientific knowledge can be exploited for politico-military purposes. It makes Laputa one of the most famous, but certainly not the last, fictional weapon of mass destruction. And so we see Laputa itself becoming a kind of metonym for mathematics as a system of controlling the universe, sort of literalized in the power of this island. Significantly, we are told that this lodestone is under the care of certain astronomers who from time to time give it such positions as the monarch directs, bringing to mind Newton's involvement with Wood's patent, a scientist under government command whose actions aid the continued oppression of the provinces, at least in Swift's view. Now, there are several other contemporary parallels implied within the account of the lodestone operators, and I haven't got time to go into those today. But it's in the episode involving the clash between Laputa and Balnabarby's second city of Lynall, where the Newtonian context is barely beneath the surface of Swift's Allegory. Here, Gulliver recounts the Laputians' shocking discovery that the citizens of Lynall assumed to represent Dublin, and as Isaac Asimov pointed out, it's got two Lyns in it. It's double Lynn. That Lynall had devised a way of disabling the flying island by self-destructively drawing the great lodestone down towards the city. The inhabitants erected 4 large towers, one at every corner of the city, which is an exact square, equal in height to a strong pointed rock that stands directly in the centre. Upon the top of each tower, as well as upon the rock, they fixed a great lodestone, and in case their design should fail, they had provided a vast quantity of the most combustible fuel, hoping to burst therewith the adamantine bottom of the island if the lodestone project should miscarry. Now, when the king of Laputa heard of this threatened insurrection, a general council was called and the officers of the lodestone ordered to attend, at which one of the oldest and expertest among them obtained leave to try an experiment. He took a strong line of 100 yards, and the island being raised over the town above the attracting power they had felt, he fastened a piece of adamant to the end of his line, which had in it a mixture of iron mineral, of the same nature with that whereof the bottom or lower surface of the island is composed, and from the lower gallery let it down slowly towards the top of the towers. The adamant was not descended 4 yards before the officer felt it drawn so strongly downwards that he could hardly pull it back. He then threw down several small pieces of adamant, and observed that they were all violently attracted by the top of the tower. The same experiment was made on the other 3 towers, and on the rock with the same effect. Now, the experiment itself and Gulliver's impartial recording of it resemble accounts of magnetism found in the Philosophical Transactions at this time, and perhaps crucially in lectures given by Swift's friend and personal physician in Dublin, Richard Helsham, who was professor of natural philosophy at Trinity College. Gulliver copies scientific reporting in stating the length of the line, the particular chemical composition of the material used, and so on. After the initial investigation, the astronomer carries out a control test, effectively, without the strong line, and then repeats the first test on the other 3 towers and on the rock. Now, critics have interpreted this whole episode allegorically as a retelling of the Woods Halfpence dispute, with the 4 large towers signifying the Grand Jury, the Irish Privy Council, and the 2 houses of the Irish Parliament. So those institutions that had been ignored by the British government when approving Wood's patent. Now, such previous readings have not identified this officer of the lodestone, and have merely stated that the experiment represents the bold resistance of the Irish institutions. But I think it can be of no coincidence that in a passage which alludes to the attempted introduction of Wood's halfpence, an experiment takes place which seeks to assay the adamant below the flying island. That it is the oldest and expertest among them surely hints at the elderly Newton in his 80s, testing the composition of Wood's coinage for the Royal Treasury. Somewhat ironically, the officer's experiment is from one perspective more scientifically valid than Newton's real assay of the halfpence. Now, the Lynall episode was not published during Swift's lifetime, and until the 1890s it existed only in manuscript, interleaved within a copy of the first edition owned by one of Swift's friends, although it's included in most editions published today. Now, there's some debate amongst textual scholars as to whether Swift composed this at the time of the first edition or it was for the second one, and whether the author himself or the publisher decided to delete it. But whatever the circumstances, I think the fragment offers an insight into Swift's mind during the 1720s, going some way in explaining the problems of coherence many critics have encountered in Gulliver's accounts of Laputa and Balnibarbi. Scholars have wondered, for instance, why the ill treatment of Ireland becomes a central concern, and this neglect is based upon the pursuit of scientific and commercial projects. The endorsement of Wood's coinage by the British political and, to all intents and purposes, scientific establishment enshrined in the dominating figure of Newton goes far in explaining this. In this light, the Voyage to Laputa is sometimes ferocious satire on mathematics and natural philosophy, and the Royal Society, which institutionalised such pursuits, is less the result of a clash between two worldviews and more a personal vendetta against the country's preeminent scientist, president of the Royal Society and master of the Mint. Now, elsewhere in the Travels, there appears to be a moment of more general reflection upon natural philosophy in Gulliver's account of Glubbdub Drib, the island of necromancers. And here Gulliver witnesses dialogues between several dead historical figures summoned up for entertainment. In conversation with the ghosts of the mechanical philosophers Descartes and Gassendi, Aristotle's phantom predicts that the theory of attraction, whereof the present learned are such zealous assertors, will be soon exploded, as his own ideas had been, because new systems of nature were but new fashions, which would vary in every age, and even those who pretend to demonstrate them from mathematical principles would flourish but a short period of time. Now, despite the universal wisdom apparently on offer in this aphorism, it's clear that the Newtonian philosophy, as outlined in the Principia and distinguished above other systems of nature by its basis in mathematical principles, is the target. Now, in one of his political pamphlets, Swift wrote that in describing the virtues and vice of mankind, it is convenient upon every article to have some eminent person in our eye. And this strategy, I think, is apparent in some of his satires on science. But the particularity of his references to Newton inevitably raises questions about readership. Some of Swift's mocking portraits suggest that they would only have been fully appreciated by a small clique of like-minded and well-read thinkers who possessed the same insider knowledge, such as his fellow satirist Pope and Arbuthnot, his natural philosopher friends at Trinity College Dublin, and perhaps the wits of Christ Church Oxford. But as I've tried to explain, I think Swift's satiric narratives simultaneously tap into more general applications. We should also note that much of what Swift does with Newton is on the cultural and personal rather than conceptual level. Detailed philosophical critique of Newtonian physics might have been beyond Swift's knowledge. Now, he did own a copy of the second edition of the Principia, 1713, but it's unclear if he ever actually bothered to read any of it, or at least much of it. Now, I'm going to conclude with an example that I think encapsulates the types of creative energy released when Swift draws upon the new natural philosophy in his writing. In the poem Cadmus and Vanessa, Swift mythologizes his possibly sexual relationship with Esther van Homrig, to whom he had been a tutor. Her knowledge, with such pains acquired, by this new passion grew inspired. Through this she made all objects pass, which gave a tincture o'er the mass. As rivers, though they bend and twine, still to the sea their course incline. Or as philosophers who find some favourite system to their mind, in every point to make it fit, will force all nature to submit. So Vanessa's love for Cadmus is figured as a prism which refracts the incident light of the things she studies. But while Newton had shown that the colours produced by the prism are not qualifications but original properties of the natural white light. Vanessa's lens of passion is bending the world, producing a distorted vision of a particular tincture, not revealing its true nature. Through Swift's poetic dexterity, the limitations of this analogy then diffuse into a simile that seeks to satirically expose the shortcomings of any system of natural philosophy. Although it's not made explicit here whether it's a poke at Newtonian optics. But I think the elisions where Swift has taken out syllables to fit in with the iambic tetrameter, the octosyllabic meter, show his own surrender to a system of poetry. So he's sort of enslaved by numbers in his own way. Now, while Swift may critique the sciences for excluding different modes of experience and thereby reducing all things to simple laws and relationships, as rhetorical ploys, his own satires often distort reality into distinct and alternative visions of what science has done or will do. He mischievously adopts extreme positions and indulges in comic possibilities rather than always passing definite judgment. And I think this interpretation is endorsed by the personal nature of many of the attacks he makes, where it seems less libelous to laugh at people for their airy speculations or for squeezing their vision through a microscope or a telescope than to make accusations of political corruption or religious heterodoxy and so on. Nonetheless, I think that Swift's writings reveal that satire can be an active and unique participant in debates about the place of science within culture, and show that ridicule is something new ideas and innovations will inevitably always attract. Thank you very much for listening.
Talking about scientific laws or whatever as being fashions that you know, got renewed. I mean, what were his own opinions about it? Was he believing mind totally ruling matter, or what?
Well, I mean, I suppose one of the best places to look for this is in A Tale of a Tub. So his sort of first main prose satire from 1704. And there he is targeting those who believe in matter in motion. You know, he is a firm believer in a relationship between the soul and the body, although he is critical of those who try and define where that relationship might happen, as it were. So in the mechanical operation of the spirit, which is appended to A Tale of a Tub, he satirises ideas of the brain that try and find a connection between the soul and the body. In terms of more general theories, I think we get the sense that the system that had been defined of regularity was sort of the most proper one. It did suggest God's influence and so on. But I think he was wary of people determining secondary causes for things that could be actually in God's hands. So, for instance, Richard Bentley in his Boyle lectures was using Newtonian ideas to show that that universal gravitation was God's presence within the universe. And Swift satirises Bentley within The Battle of the Books, saying that he has this tendency to wheel upon himself. There's like a centripetal thing about him, that he's stuck in his own head, as it were. So certainly there we can see that the problem is those who inquire too much, that we should leave some things alone, that only God can know those things. So he has a sense that that through the fall, man has been denied his sort of full capacities, as it were. And only God has knowledge of certain things. So I think it might be more about the theological appropriation of Newton's ideas that he has more a problem with than the ideas themselves, as it were.
Hi. Probably more like a historical question.
Yeah.
In terms of circulation of the text in the 18th century to like the European continent, because his writing is very similar to later writings of like Voltaire.
Yeah.
The kind of satirical travel writings. Do you know the extent to which it was kind of read on the continent?
Well, I mean, in terms of Voltaire, I mean, he visited London, and he was, he certainly read the Travels. You're thinking of Candide and other writings. I mean, so yeah, that's. I mean, so Voltaire, yes, I mean, he came over here, as it were. The Travels were translated into French, I think, in 1727. It's almost straight after, and actually, some of the best illustrations appear in those French editions compared to the original English ones.
Yes, the letter to the lady, I don't know if you know who that is. He says principles on which men move are private self-interest and base self-love. Seems to anticipate Adam Smith or David Ricardo there. I'm not sure he's speaking about economics particularly, but does he anticipate them, and do you know who the lady is and what date is this letter?
Gosh, I don't know who the lady is who wrote the poem to Swift. I don't, it's difficult to determine that.
So to a lady, Swift never wrote these lines.
So no, they weren't written by Swift, or maybe they were,
right,
but they were addressed to him.
Oh right,
yeah, it was
a letter to a lady, not from a lady, I think.
Oh, sorry. Well, if it was, I'm sorry about that error. But it was written to Swift, so based upon what Swift had been writing in the Drapier's letters.
Oh, yes. So no source for that.
So no, I don't know who the author is of that.
And the other one is new systems of nature were but fashions. And this seems to anticipate Karl Popper, which is that every time we get a new system, it's overturned again in the future.
Yeah, quite right.
Swift, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, I mean, quite right. I mean, I think he is anticipating those sorts of ideas. I mean, in A Tale of a Tub, Newton writes about introducers in new philosophy, in the digression on madness there. And he characterises Descartes and Epicurus and others of having a kind of madness at that time, and that those ideas come out in that way. But then, and it's to do with a sort of a string twined up in one's head, a string of human understanding at that point. And so, but as time changes, the new systems arise, partly due to madness.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
To what extent do we know about the responses by the philosophical community to Swift's Gulliver's Travels in particular? I mean, in the 17th century, the fellows were pretty aware of jokes and satires that were being written about them, but I'm not quite sure about this period.
Well, Arbuthnot, who was one of his friends, who was a member of the Royal Society, wrote that he doesn't actually state what it's thought of in the Royal Society, but at least people in London considered the part of the projectors the least brilliant. And but I think it's partly on Arbuthnot. That's partly Arbuthnot coming through, because he had written to Swift previously saying he had lots of ideas that Swift could include within the Travels, and it seemed that Swift had ignored them and had just done his own thing. So Arbuthnot was full of knowledge about what was going on because of his particular position in London at that time, whereas Swift was over in Dublin.